Good evening. I'm Betsy Fowler. I'm the director of the Williamsburg Regional Library, and welcome to our 4th annual One Book, One Community Read and Author event. And this series is made possible by a partnership between the Williamsburg Regional Library, the College of William and Mary Libraries, and our Wonderful Friends Foundation. And I also want to recognize the wonderful staff at both libraries who work for months in preparing the events, and also the James City County Video Services who are here with us each year filming the event to share online. Each year, a committee works to select a book that speaks to an important issue of our time. The role of libraries is to create a civic space for the exchange of ideas and civil dialogue that helps to support a robust democracy. Thank you for joining us tonight and being part of this community conversation. And I'm delighted to introduce my dear friend and colleague, the Dean of Libraries for the College of William and Mary, Carrie Cooper, who will introduce the author.
Thank you. It's a special day every year when our libraries come together to host an author, and to see our community come together is really special. I just want to remind you before I introduce our guests that we have created something special in Williamsburg with this partnership. The people in our community are welcome to come into SWEM Library and check out our books and our videos and our DVDs and use our spaces and use our genealogy resources and databases. And the people who work at William and Mary, regardless of where they live, maybe they live in Newport News or they live in Richmond, they can all come if they're a staff member and they can check out the resources at Williamsburg Regional Library. That is special. That doesn't happen in every community. So I'm really proud that we've done that. It just means that we have more community users, more users of libraries, and whatever is convenient, whatever meets your needs, you have choices, which is really wonderful. So I'm going to move on to the introduction of our guests tonight. I'm going to start with Micheline Marcom. She's the author of 7 novels, including a trilogy of books about the Armenian genocide and its aftermath in the 20th century. Her first novel, Three Apples Fell from Heaven, was a New York Times notable book and runner-up for the PEN/Hemingway Award for First Fiction. Her second novel, The Daydreaming Boy, won the PEN USA Award for Fiction. Micheline has received fellowships and awards from the Lannan Foundation, the Whiting Foundation, and the U.S. Artists Foundation. In 2008, she taught in Beirut, Lebanon, on a Fulbright Fellowship. Born in Saudi Arabia and raised in Los Angeles, Micheline splits her time, which I know is not true anymore. She actually lives full-time in Virginia, where she is a professor of creative writing at UVA. She is the founding and creative director of the New American Story Project, a digital oral history project focused on unaccompanied Central American minors who are journeyed to the U.S. And tonight, our conversation will be moderated by a professor from William and Mary, Dr. John Rio Frio, also known as Rio, to those of us who know him well. He is the director of the Hispanic Studies program at William and Mary, and he serves as associate professor. He earned his PhD in English from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has been a dedicated educator for over 20 years, teaching, coaching, tutoring every age group from pre-K to PhD students. He has served his community in many ways as a summer camp counselor, a soccer coach for at-risk middle school boys, as an elementary school teacher. I learned that about you. We have that in common. Rio was the recipient of the 2015 Thomas Jefferson Award for Excellence in Teaching. That's a big deal on our campus. He is an amazing teacher, scholar. And he serves on William and Mary's DACA Undocumented Advisory and Support Council, which provides support and advocacy efforts at William and Mary for our students with DACA status. Rio will be serving as our interviewer tonight. And we look forward to the conversation. Thank you both for being here.
Carrie, I think you took my book.
I think I took your pen.
Oh, my pen. I need a pen, otherwise I feel naked. So when we talked, I think, Tammy, you and I were emailing We talked about to maybe start with a bit of reading from the book. There you are. So I'm going to read for probably about 20 minutes, and then we will have a conversation. Can you hear me okay? First of all, just thank you so much. It's so nice to be in a library. I think I said this earlier today, but growing up, books really saved my life, and all those librarians who ran those libraries in Los Angeles for a young kid who felt pretty out of place and not super happy always at home, it was through books that I found my way. And in many ways, the reason I became a writer was not initially because I was writing so much as reading. I just read. I read, and of course, I still love to read. And I'm grateful to the writers and the carers of books, all the many librarians. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone. I want to thank William and Mary for inviting me, of course, and the Williamsburg Library, as well as the Friends of the Williamsburg Library. This is such a beautiful thing that you're doing, reading together. I get to do it with my students, but that's it. So thank you. So I think I'm going to read from the opening. I know some of you maybe have read the book, and some haven't. This was my 7th book, and so each book I write, I'm taking up something, usually something that's obsessing me or feels important to me or is going to get me to spend, the hours and hours and years in my chair working on a book. They take a long time to make. And this book in particular, when I wrote the first draft in 2012, the year actually the book takes place, I had never done anything like that. I have written historical fiction about the Armenian genocide. I've written about what happened in Guatemala, the genocide there during the 80s, but I had never written something that was unfolding in time as I was writing it. And that was an interesting thing to try to do, and to try to honor the people whose stories I was trying to tell, people I know personally and people that I found out about through listening to their stories, sometimes just on YouTube and just through phones. And at that time, as I think I was saying this earlier today, there wasn't a lot in the media, at least in the United States. Mexico, yes, and Central America. But we can get to that. So I'm just going to read a little bit. It's nice to be read to. This is the very, very opening, which my editor hated, but we can talk about that later. I don't want to say mean things about her, but... Behold the girl, and see how her brow illuminates the penumbra as if it itself were a source of light. She turns, and in the dimness he can see the back of her head, the long dark hair, the tube-sharp lines of her scapula in relief against the fabric of her t-shirt. How long is the wait for the train, she says. The darkness lightens. They are at the railway yard, and she is standing next to the steel rails. Small white-gray stones lie beneath her feet, and the passengers' detritus, discarded papers, plastic bags, cigarette butts is mixed among them. On the tracks behind her, the bottom portion of a young boy's body lies prone, its stiff legs clad in torn blue jeans, its small feet shod in old tennis shoes. Milo, whose is it? She asks. The girl turns to face him and gazes directly into his eyes now, and he can see her beauty more fully, its refulgence, and then, as if from an obscure room of his imagination, a sign. The horizontal line of her eyes, dark pupil to dark pupil, adjoins the vertical length made from nose to chin midway between her brows, T. And behold the symbols, he thinks, and how they and all of our stories are dark phenomena of this dark earth. My editor didn't like that because it's kind of at a high register, and it's talking about stories and symbols. But for me, that was important because, books are symbols, they're symbolic form, and I needed that register to open the book because then we will get into a narrative. And I think a lot about symbols. Symbols pull things together. In fact, the opposite of the word symbol it's symbolos from the Greek, and its antonym is diabolos, which in English we get the word devil. It's to pull apart. And I think one of the things that literature can do in its symbolic form is allow us to see things together in a distilled kind of way. And even the cross of Tau, which is a T, is an old symbol going back to Sumerian times and is the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Anyway, these are the kinds of things that writers do when you have a lot of time on your hands. You think about words, you think about symbols, what do they mean, and these kind of levels of reality that a symbol can encode. I think it was Jung who said the symbol is never reducible to one or two meanings. And that's very important, because reality, whatever it is, whatever we can perceive of it as, is complex, right? It's multi-leveled. And our minds can maybe grasp one little light of it and one other little piece and one other little piece. But the whole thing is a big pattern, certainly beyond my ken. So this is from the next portion called The Train. He is on the bus. The old Bluebird school bus slowly climbs the steep and winding dirt road as it leaves the green, misty valley of Todos Santos behind on its way to Huehuetenango, 2 hours away, but he cannot see any of it through the windows in the darkness. In the seats near him, women hold their babies and toddlers, and the old men hold their straw hats in their laps. Bound chickens squawk and crick from their baskets overhead. The bus is filled with people of all ages and with their things tied up in big cloth sacks and cheap plastic bags. The engine is loud and cranks, and the bus is crowded and cold, and he wonders again, how many days will it take to arrive, and can I ever get it all back? He had dressed carefully in the hour before dawn at his great-aunt's house in dark blue jeans, a long-sleeve shirt, a T-shirt beneath that, new white tennis shoes with a red stripe sewn onto their sides, and his red baseball cap. He grabbed his nylon jacket at the last moment, and although it is the beginning of the warmer rainy season in the highlands, the old bus is damp and unheated, and he is glad he is wearing it. He had already decided to bring the silver wristwatch his mother gave him 3 years ago when he graduated from high school, and he turns his left wrist and looks at it 5:20 a.m. He holds his small green backpack tightly on his lap. Inside his old school pack, he carries a plastic bottle of water, 2 lollipops he bought yesterday with his cousin's children from a market stall, a paperback novel, a new journal where he plans to keep a record of this journey, and a ballpoint pen. He carries an extra T-shirt, 2 changes of underwear, 1 pair of white athletic socks, a toothbrush, some paste, and a small piece of hard soap he had wrapped in a scrap of paper. He has $400 US hidden beneath the insoles of his tennis shoes, 200 in each shoe, all of what had remained in his bank account in California, and 300 quetzales tucked into one of the pockets of his blue jeans. He carries another $40 in the other pocket, along with a small photograph of her folded between 2 $10 bills. He thinks of the things he now carries on this bus and of what he left behind in Todos Santos. Several pairs of blue jeans, T-shirts, the traditional red-striped pants and hand-woven shirt his aunt purchased for him upon his arrival in town 2.5 weeks ago. Without it, Emilio, you won't look like one of our men, she'd said. A second pair of tennis shoes, 3 books he was assigned at university last term, his school ID, his old mobile telephone, his bank card. He thinks of his cash, his silver watch, the red cap and green pack, and the book and journal and pen, and how some things transit the earth easily and others do not. And he thinks how Aunt Lourdes will soon rise from her bed and discover his absence when she doesn't find him in the main room on the sleeping pallet she borrowed from her eldest son, Anselmo, how she will walk next door and give Anselmo the news, and his cousin will thereupon phone Berkeley, and how his mother and sisters in Berkeley will begin to worry, as perhaps will she if she is apprised of it. Yet even so, he will not call or contact his family or his girlfriend until he has made it a good distance from here. His mind is set on this course of action, and he will follow it. And the wind she has imagined took residence inside him last February, ponderous and metallic, abutting his sternum, turns and pulls a wire from his bowels toward his stomach until his throat also cinches, and he puts his hand into the jeans pocket with the quetzales and finds and fingers the white stone Antonia found for him on a beach in Northern California 4 months ago, and he carries it back with him to the north. So if you've read the book, you know that that's the beginning of Emilio, who was deported from Berkeley and is now in a small town in Guatemala, and he's going to, he decides, make his way back to the United States, the only home he's ever really known, as he was brought over when he was young. It's a very dangerous journey, the migrant trail. Also, you may know, it's a dynamic situation. It's changing all the time. In this book, when I wrote it, people were riding on La Bestia, which is it's the cargo trains in Mexico, and They don't allow migrants to ride inside, the Central Americans who are crossing Mexico, so they would climb on top and ride on the top of the trains. That's very, very dangerous. You have to hop on a running train, you climb on top. Many people were killed, falling off, trying to get on, etc. And one of the questions I ask myself is, what would cause someone to take that kind of risk? So things have to be, pretty bad at home if you're going to take that risk. And later, when I was working on the oral history project and started interviewing children who came unaccompanied, I also asked myself, what parent would send a child alone on a very, very dangerous journey through Mexico where migrants are, in so much peril and very vulnerable if they're undocumented in Mexico. And those were some things that I started to try to understand better, both in writing this novel and then afterward. Read a little bit more. So I think I'm going to jump ahead to page 121. Just read a little bit when they are catching the cargo train, and then maybe a teeny bit from the end when they're in the desert. Whenever I read the desert section, I get really thirsty. It's like I need to have some water. When I was writing that desert sequence, I was so thirsty the whole time and sad. It's a sad situation to try to walk across the Sonoran Desert. Okay. He is disoriented. So now he's met some Hondurans. Emilio has, Matilde, Jonathan, William, and Pedro, and he's traveling with them now on the migrant trail. And some things have happened already that I decided to not read out loud tonight that have not been easy. They were attacked. And now they are, I can't remember what day we are right now, a few days into the journey. He is disoriented when he first opens his eyes. His head aches, his mouth is dry. Where am I? He sees walls made of concrete blocks and a large room filled with foam mattresses covering the floor, dozens of strangers sleeping on them in their street clothes. There is a long window at the far end of the room near the ceiling with a crisscross of metal bars through which he can see a patch of blue sky. A small icon of the Virgin hangs below it. He sits up, his head is pounding. He turns and sees Matilde sleeping peacefully next to Jonathan in the sleeveless shirt she wore yesterday evening. He remembers Ixtepec. They depart after breakfast. They are all still tired, but the salve on their faces, the doses of aspirin for their aches and other pains, and their full bellies of hot food have bolstered them. They each carry a black plastic bag with a sandwich and a bottle of water the volunteers gave them. Pedro says they need to get out of the south quickly, give it their best, forward going. The day is warm and bright and humid. When the five arrive at the depot, the tracks are already covered with pods of migrants. Hundreds wait as they do to catch the next northbound train. They find a small spot on the dirt and sit, and in only 2 hours they hear the familiar air horn and see a massive locomotive approaching. What luck, Pedro says. We could have been stranded here for days. Hurry, he says. This one's going fast and not stopping. The five run alongside the moving train with their black bags with the multitude. Come on, the migrants already on board yell to those who are attempting to grab the ladders, come on. Emilio is beginning to breathe hard as he runs, and the train cars pass him one after another. Matilde gets ahead of him, and he sees Jonathan, who is taller than most of the other travelers, pulling her by the hand. Then chaos ensues. The beast begins to leave the depot. That's the train. Emilio is running and breathing hard, and dozens of people around him and in front of him are vying for the metal ladders, pushing at each other, yelling epithets, struggling to make it aboard. Emilio darts ahead of 2 young women and a third who is pulling a small child by the hand, and he grabs for a ladder, then stumbles and falls. He thinks that's it, I'm killed or maimed, but he only hits the rocks hard on his knees and stands again. He has dropped his black bag, he runs. He can no longer see his friends. Strangers surround and push against him, and his ankle turned when he fell, and it hurts now as he grabs onto one of the last ladders on the last car. The horn blasts again, and migrants above him yell their support. Come on, muchacho, you've got it. Don't let go, you can make it. Emilio swings one and then his second foot onto the ladder's rung as he heaves himself onto the crowded end of the hopper. The train leaves dozens of migrants and Ixtepec behind. He climbs to the roof of the crowded boxcar. He doesn't see Matilde or the others on top of this one, and he asks several of the men if they've seen a young woman with black hair with blonde streaks in it, slim, very pretty, and they say no, they haven't seen her. He walks the length of the car and asks a woman holding a baby in her arms if she's seen his friends, 4 Hondurans, he says, and she shakes her head and he jumps to the next boxcar. Be careful, man, you'll get yourself killed, one guy yells at him from behind, but Emilio is starting to panic, and he's not listening to the warnings, and the travelers are yelling, and the travels are yelling. What if I've lost them, he thinks. The train begins to pick up speed outside the town limits. He walks across the roof of the second boxcar, stepping between and around the prone and seated bodies that cover it to capacity. Some of the bodies say, "Slow down, muchacho, what's your hurry?" He steps on a man's hand, and the man yells curses at his retreating back as the great metal beast he moves forward, swings laterally like a monster as it rushes along the tracks. He jumps to the next wagon, and he still can't see them. He's looking into the many tired faces and the many fearful, questioning eyes. Is he a delinquent? Does he work for the cartel? And he doesn't stop or care about their tired longings and abundant fear. He jumps onto a tank car next. It rounds down steeply on each side. There are only 5 migrants in the middle of this car. They hold on to a small, circular metal railing. He slowly makes his way forward, afraid to slip and fall and be left behind in this God-forsaken land. He says, "I'm looking for a young Honduran girl with black hair with blonde streaks in it," to the 5 men who are staring at him intently. They're not sure if he's lying, if he hides a machete or a knife or a gun, and an older man says, "No, sir, we haven't seen that girl." They look at him with this trepidation and anxiety, and as he moves past them, he says, "Thank you, I'm only looking for her." He comes to the end of the tank car and sees a faded red boxcar, and the train lurches. He loses his footing for a moment and falls to his knees and grabs hold of a protruding metal seam. The beast's horn begins to blow loudly, and the smoke is rising, the land moving from them. His heart beats so strongly in his chest now, he is certain it strains against his sternum, hits his chest bone again and again as if to bruise it. Then he stands erect, and without thinking, he leaps to the old red boxcar and lands safely. All right, I think I'll stop at that section. And one other tiny section. So then they ride the cargo trains, they make it to Mexico City, then they get up to the border, Matilde and Emilio do, and then they reunite with the other 2 who made it with them, and then they are at the Sonoran Desert in a town called Sasabe, and they have to walk. They've been told they'll walk for 1 day or less to get, they have 2 guides with them, 2 coyotes as they're called. I'm just going to read, I'm on page 222, just going to read a page. Oh, it's going to be hot. So they're in the desert. And they're with a group of other people. When you cross the desert, you usually cross with a guide, if you can. I heard recently that now the guides coming from Central America are $15,000. You get 3 chances to get across the border. That's a lot of money. It's gone up. The group begins walking. They are 16 men, 3 women, and 1 child. Oaxacans, Guatemalans, Veracruzanos, Hondurans, and 2 men in their 20s from Mexico City. They are mostly people from the green, lush lands of the South. They don't know the desert or the dry heat or its force. They are silent. They feel anxious because the plans have changed, but they all follow the instructions and follow Nexo, their guide. The dirt trail before them is filled with trash. As they walk, they see discarded water bottles, old clothes, empty food wrappers, a hairbrush. It is 6 o'clock. It is still hot, and the light is bright, and they are all sweating, but they hope the heat is waning. The low, dry hills rise above them, the white, rippling clouds sit low in the light blue sky, and big, thorny cacti and brittle bush and ocotillo lie at intervals. Sand and rocks beneath their feet, creosote and a palo verde tree. Pedro is in line behind the older Oaxacan man, followed by Matilde, then Emilio, and William behind him. She carries her black backpack and a 1-gallon jug of water in her hand. Emilio is holding a jug of water in each hand, and his backpack makes him even hotter. The back of his t-shirt is already soaked through with his sweat, and he's excited that in only a few more hours, he will be back in the United States. Finally, he thinks, I'll be on American soil. The sun is setting, the air and the ground remain hot. This is the strongest heat any of the walkers has ever known. They are thirsty, their mouths begin to dry. Just a little bit of water, they think, and they take a sip of their water, and their throats dry out between each small sip. Their lips soon begin to crack, and they are licking their lips to soothe them, and they sweat, and the water of their bodies wets their clothes, and the heat dries it. They hear the howls of animals, and the stars begin to shine in the sky overhead, and each tries to avoid twisting his ankle and keep up with the group and walks. They are more thirsty. If they are not drinking, the roofs of their mouths and tongues become sticky, and they desire water, and their spit starts to turn to paste in their mouths. They lick their lips continuously. They cross a barbed wire fence, and now they are in the United States. We have made it across the line, Emilio thinks, and it's so hot, and I'm thirsty, I have a bad taste in my mouth. He takes another sip of his water, and after all the travels, the travails, it was nothing more than a broken-down fence between the two nations, no more than flimsy wires keeping me out, and the vast desert. Only a few more hours to go now, one more day until I am back. The walkers go as quietly as they can. Each man and each woman keeps his and her own thoughts. The ground is not cool, and for the old Oaxacan who walks in plastic sandals, his feet have been burning him a long time. Matilda's legs ache and her fingers hurt from holding the gallon of water which, walking and drinking, begins to lose its weight. They think about the step in front of them and the next one. Emilio's hot feet sweat inside of his tennis shoes and swell in the night. They walk for hours, they drink the precious water from their jugs and think soon we'll be in Phoenix. Just one more sip of water, it's so dry. Just one small sip, Phoenix must be close, just over this next rise. I think I'll stop there.
Plan is to have a conversation for some time, and then we'll end with a few questions from the audience. Is that still our plan, Micheline? Yes. Okay, all right, great. So I guess I just wanted to start by maybe reiterating my sense of gratitude for this event. I think that what the Williamsburg Public Library and SWEM do in creating community in this way, I think is something it's magical, and I had this really beautiful image of many of us sitting at our homes reading this book in unison, and I just think that's a very powerful thing. So I'm grateful that this exists. Okay. I have so many things in my head, and
Me too.
And I've been thinking about this author lately. His name is Andres Neumann, and he's from Argentina. And he won a prestigious prize, the Premio Alfaguara, in 2009 for one of his novels. But he has this really beautiful book called El Equilibrista, which means the tightrope walker, that's full of aphorisms. And so I've kind of sprinkled some of my questions with these aphorisms because I think that they're so short and pithy, and yet they contain so much. So I wanted to offer this first one, and he writes, se escribe desde dos lugares, el agradecimiento o el rencor, which translated means that one writes from two places, two places, gratitude or rancor, rage. And so I was thinking about this, and you might not agree with that. You might not agree with that binary of gratitude or rage. And his aphorisms, I think, in some places are kind of purposefully provocative. But I guess I'm wondering if this novel is born out of gratitude or rage or both. If not, where, I know that it was written a while ago. I know that you wrote it in 2012, and it took some time for folks to be interested in it, which is, I think, also says something. But if that's not the place from where you're writing great gratitude and rage, like, is there an emotional place that you can think of where this novel kind of is born?
Is my thing on? Oh, okay. Sorrow. Yeah. My mother's like, when are you going to stop writing sad books? But, I think that there are certain inheritances that we probably all have from our families, and some of those inheritances maybe we didn't even get languaged growing up or didn't even get storied. And I am the granddaughter of two people who survived a genocide. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that wasn't talked about. I grew up very far from them. But there's a way in which that melancholy and that sorrow, I mean, if you get together, I was just hanging out with a friend of mine who's Armenian a few weeks ago, and we met some other Armenians. You sit down, the first thing Armenians do is say, where are you from? And what they mean is, what village did your grandparents or your great-grandparents come from? Because all of us are in diaspora because of that event in history. So weirdly, I wouldn't exist had that event not happened, another strange thing. Anyway, I think there is probably a sorrow. I mean, Armenians have this thing, and it's not the only reason I write. Duty, a sense of duty. Like I was saying this earlier, I think literature has many capacities. I love books. Thank you to all of you who make books, possible in the world. And I think they can work as a kind of place for the dead. As a cenotaph, I was saying that earlier. It's not my idea. It's a writer I admire quite a lot, Danilo Kish. And they also, I think, can take things which in history you might just read, I don't know, let's say you're talking about a war or the Holocaust, you'd say 6 million Jews were killed. Well, then you don't feel anything. And literature has this capacity that when we read a book, our consciousness is with the consciousness of that book and that story. And to me, that's remains so profound and so magical. So I don't know, rancor, and gratitude. I guess love,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess
love is always the source of art in some ways in my mind.
No, I guess I think what attracted me about the aphorism, even though it's like, I think very purposefully binary, is that, when you read about someone like Emilio, who grows up, in the US, goes to UC Berkeley, is so deeply rooted in the United States, is, to put it one way, he's American.
Yeah.
He's lacking the formal documentation that explicitly states him as such, but he's an American kid. And I think that the novel, when you read it, it's so evocative, and I think that I found myself feeling a lot of sorrow, but it's hard not to feel some rage. It's hard not to feel, even in his own sense of frustration about this really thin line that differentiates him from his other friends, like when he wants to go get a driver's license at 16 and has no conceptualization of why he can't do what every one of his friend group is doing, right? And I think that particularly for young people and for dreamers, it does feel a bit more like rage. And so I just found myself thinking about this binary of gratitude and rage, which aren't necessarily polar opposites.
Yeah, but, yeah. Well, I mean, anger, rage, and then hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he does feel that way. And because you're betrayed by the place that is your home. You don't get to call it home. I mean, that makes no sense to me. And so arbitrary.
So I have this other idea here. So Micheline was on a panel earlier today, a really excellent panel with two of my colleagues at the university, and you said something that in the last several hours has just kind of stuck with me. I had all of these other questions that I was thinking about asking, and this one just sort of kind of forced its way to the top. And you were offering this overview of your body of 7 novels. And you were speaking at the time briefly about this trilogy that you had written about the Armenian genocide. And you said in a kind of very offhand way, but you said, quote, "Sometimes I write about war, but I also like to write about beauty." And I was just thinking about this as a very simple but profound statement, right? This desire to choose where you direct your words, right? Like you talked about this sense of duty, and it feels, I think, in some ways easy to conceptualize. Not easy, but there's an easy connection between this sense of duty and writing about a deep, heavy topic like war or genocide or undocumented migration. And I think it's a different feeling to say, I just want to write about beauty, right? And so if you don't mind, I know that you've been reading your book to people all day. Can I read your book to people?
Sure.
Is that all right with all of you for a second?
Nice.
So I as you were talking about this part, and I had this passage that I picked out that I was secretly up here hoping that you weren't going to read out loud. So this is on page 148. And they've been on the train already on La Bestia. And I think more importantly, Emilio and his fellow travelers have experienced really already some profound violence. I won't really catalog it here, but the novel is full of violence that takes so many different forms. There's, the physical violence from assailants, but there's also the violence of the train itself, what it's like to, for example, ride on this train for hours holding on, fearful that you might slip off. The weather itself is a kind of violence that enacts on them. They're just kind of defenseless. And then eventually the desert. The desert enacts profound violence on all of them as they're walking. We haven't gotten there yet in the story. And so here's the passage that I'll read, and it's a slightly longer one, but it says, the sun begins its descent, and the migrants on the top of the train are relieved of the sun's rays on their heads and arms and backs. The wide fields extend out from the beast's body, a flat, inert extension of the beast's rage and speed. Night approaches. Emilio hears someone yelling from above, and like all the riders, he feels a steep rise in his trepidation that the police are ahead in the distance, or narcos, or the migra, or a gangster is aboard the train. Look up! He stands and leans out of the car and sees a man on the adjacent boxcar pointing to the sky above them. The sun is setting, deep red fills the horizon, the moon has risen, and the European starlings in a flock of 1,000 birds lift as one from a cornfield as the beast roars by them. Come see, he tells her, and she joins him at the metal railing. The flock breaks into 3 groups that now move in circles, crisscrossing one another. The iridescent black of the birds' bodies, the blue of the sky, the red and yellow of the crepuscule, and the yellow moon converge as the birds swing around, push into and out of one another, turn the evening into a wild circumlocution of black on red and blue and yellow. It is like watching the vigorous, vertiginous movement of waves on a canvas of the air, Emilio thinks. Now a black wall of birds rises. Now it crashes into the adjacent flock. Now the two become one column of upward black-bodied speed, fall to the earth but do not crash into it, swing across the land like a sheet of water skimming the side of a wall, then lift again, moving upward as one, a tower ascending and descending. During the ruckus, there is never a collision. The murmuration flails the air and makes it, or it makes them, one large, united animal being. As if God himself were among us, the Salvadoran now standing next to Emilio says. He will be with thee, he will not fail thee, his young female companion says. How do they do it? Matilda asks. It's their nature from thousands to become one. This is their only defense against the larger hawks and falcons that prey on them, the Salvadoran says. I have, okay, yeah. I love this passage for a lot of reasons. On the one hand, I think it's really just beautiful writing. And so one of the questions I'm kind of thinking about asking you to talk about is this juxtaposition of beauty and pain and suffering, right? Because the novel is full of these little moments that are so tender and really beautiful amidst some very painful, some very significant suffering. But I also wanted to just sort of, and I don't know that this is a question, I just wanted to share what I was thinking. My colleague, Teresa Longo, today mentioned Martin Espada, the Puerto Rican poet, the Neo-Rican poet, and he has this idea of poets of the political imagination, right? And his idea is, and it's not just his, Ariel Dorfman is another writer who talks about this, that social change and a different possibility isn't, you can't do anything until you've imagined it, right? And Espada talks about how slavery ends when we begin to imagine manacled hands free of their chains, right? So the poetry and poetic imagination as opening the door to these possibilities. And I just had this really beautiful moment of these starlings as a metaphor for what unity looks like, yeah. Right? What it looks like for all these many thousands of bodies to move in unison, and what a beautiful image of what a community should be. So I don't know, these just some thoughts I've got.
I was like, what was the first question? Oh, beauty.
Yeah. No, I think two things. I think maybe the question is really, maybe this is kind of an obvious one, but what is sort of like the impulse of putting together this really, these manifestations of pain and suffering, and at the same time, all of this lyricism that kind of erupts through the novel?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure I can answer this well. It's something I've thought a lot about. I thought about it from my first novel, which is, takes up the Armenian genocide in the towns my grandparents were from. And I started today a little bit talking about literature as symbolic form. I mean, these things happen, right? Things are happening now. There's wars happening now. People are suffering now, here, I'm sure, is everywhere. Human life is filled with tragedy. And then we have stories. We tell stories as humans. And then we have these things called books also. And I guess, I mean, I think for myself that I hold myself accountable to whatever, often the people that I'm trying to write about, especially in these kinds of books, and really honoring them in the best way I can. And if I fail as a novelist, it's my failure, and I own that, but I certainly try my best. I think that's all we can do. So I guess I think about that, but in the case of this book and some of the the people who inspired it, the resilience of so many people that I have talked to, anybody I've talked to on this side of the line who's made it here, the stories, the resilience, the faith, whether it's devotion to God or belief in the higher power. I mean, it's extraordinary, and that kind of resilience that I've seen in many of those children and in many people, I think is astonishing and beautiful, and the capacity we have for human beings to overcome. And I don't think that books change anything, and I don't think they're therapy, and I don't think they're exotic journeys, but I think even in making books, there's a therapeuticness in them. They are alchemical in ways that it's hard for me to even talk about, but I know from doing it. And maybe it's because, while there's tragedy, there is also always beauty. I was saying to students today, they're like, this woman is nuts. But I was like, you guys, think about photosynthesis. I mean, it's amazing, It is.
Yeah.
Photosynthesis is amazing. We don't really understand trees on some deep level. I'm no biologist, but just like, what is going on here? Sunlight, water, and so that's part of life too. In the midst of tragedy, there is also always sunlight and this earth we live on, which is such an extraordinary thing to pay attention to. I'm no cynic.
Yeah.
I'm just no cynic, even though there has been tragedy in my own family, and I've certainly tried to do my part to be a witness to my time of being alive in the ways that I have chosen, or been chosen. But I don't ever want to lose sense of, the beauty of the ocean, or sometimes I just think about whales, whatever it is. And I feel sad about the whales. I'm like, oh, I feel sad, and I write something about whales. Or like, I have a book coming out that's these little prose pieces, and one of the little pieces is about those lobsters in the supermarket with their claws rubber banded. I'm like, I thought about that for a while. So I have time to ruminate on these kinds of things. I mean, I think where we put our attention is so important. Is like the life that we live. Where did I put my attention in my life? And so some of my attention has gone to thinking about some of these historical and actual things, and also probably for my own spirit, some of it is beauty and trees and those lobsters and whatever it is. Language, I love language. I don't even know what language is. I mean, sometimes if I get really, this is a person who spends too much time in her basement, but do we know what words are? And those symbolic things that make meaning in your mind, and then we developed a writing system. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
That's why the Egyptians knew there was magic in the script. So I just don't want to forget that, because we humans are very social, and we fill each other with joy and fear. It's called social media. Fear. You know, like we're spreading fear around just
Yeah.
as much as anything else. It's like a contagion.
Yeah, maybe that's a good. I have a different question I'm thinking about asking. I'll skip ahead because you mentioned social media, and so this
sorry.
section, this section of the talk is like writing novels during the age of TikTok, right?
Yes.
And going back to Andres Neumann, he has another aphorism where he writes, "Leer como si dentro de un minuto nos fueran a apagar la luz," which translated means read as if read as if in a minute someone was going to come and turn off the light, right? And I was just thinking about this idea because I suspect that folks who are enthusiastic about one book, one community, and this project are readers and can remember that feeling of being in your bed with your book, knowing that at any point someone's going to come and turn off the light and make you stop reading. And if you're, if you've got some foresight, you have your little flashlight ready to go, right?
Yep.
And you're just going to read. And I love that he makes us think about that. That just impassioned devotion to books and words and language. But I think we also have to recognize that the advent of our cell phones we know that it's doing really dramatic things to our brain. And I'll include myself. My daughter's in the front row. She's heard this sermon a million times, right?
My son's not here, so
yeah.
Part of it.
But it's on Zoom, so he can get the sermon. But right, we're thinking about the ways in which our cell phones have really rewired our brains, and in particular our attention spans, right? And what it feels like to try to concentrate, long enough. And so I guess my question isn't a particularly deep one, but from your perspective as a writer, but also, as you said, kind of an inveterate, impassioned reader, what do we lose when we stop writing and reading novels? Or alternative, maybe more positively, what do we gain by going back to novels?
Yeah. So when I was talking to the students today, we started talking about social media, and then 10 minutes in, it was like, wow, I was like, you guys, how do you feel? And they're like, bad. I was like, me too, I feel bad, And what I didn't say, because it's hard to say, but the other thing about literature for me is it's not just what it says in the words, it's the way that literature, poems, it's how they reach the space of the nonverbal, actually. And that's hard to talk about, but when you're reading a book and something's happening to you, to your consciousness, your soul, or whatever, you're going someplace, maybe even beyond language, to the not word. One of my favorite writers, Brazilian writer, Clarice Lispector, would say, the things that are hard to put into language, even something, whatever the experience of love is, or some of these higher states. And that's what reading also does for me. When I started writing, part of it was because I don't like talking. Or I find speech actually very debased. Conversation is small talk most of the time. And or it's like selling you detergent, or something. Like we're using language all the time to sell things, to convince each other, to annoy each other, to scream at each other, to try to convince people of our political opinions. But not in books and not in poems, like whatever we're going to call literature. It's not seeking to persuade. It's not rhetoric. It's seeking to talk about things that are also beyond language, that exceed language, because language is a human thing. But whatever this thing is, reality, the real, it's how do you get there?
Yeah.
How do you get to those kinds of levels? And so language is one way, but it's almost beyond it. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I think about things like this too.
I feel like you're making sense to me, so
yeah, that's good.
Carrie, are we okay, or can we? Okay, great. So I have a question that is maybe a little bit more personal, which you're free to ignore. But I mentioned this to you when we were chatting yesterday, that some years ago I had the opportunity to meet a hero of mine, a literary hero of mine, who's the Portuguese writer José Saramago, who passed away a number of years ago, but he's just an incredible, thoughtful, philosophical writer. And I was going to see him give a talk, and my dad and I, the elevator doors opened, and he was standing there. And the two of us were just starstruck. And my dad, who was a very, very composed man, said something like, we are your favorite people, or you are our favorite fan, or something. Like, he got it all backwards, right? Like, and I was teasing my dad later because, you know, he liked to always be super composed. But that was just a tangent in his honor. But the point of the story is that in that moment in the elevator, really without thinking about it, and in that same rush of emotion, I said to him, I said, you know, Señor Saramago, you are a very cruel man. And he looked at me with real, like, shock and horror. And this was, I later kind of pieced together that one of his really principal ideas is that human beings are the only animal that's capable of cruelty, right? And so for him, this use of the word cruel, he was really like, his radar was up. Mm-hmm. And I said really quickly, I said, well, no, it's just that your novel, Baltasar and Blimunda, which is translated as Memorial of the Convent, I said that novel made me weep. Like, just really physically, concretely, it made me weep. And he said to me, and I wrote this down because I remember this quote, he said to me, "Ay, joven, déjame asegurarte que donde ha llorado el lector, también ha llorado el autor," which means, young man, let me assure you that where the reader has wept, so too has the author. And I remember this moment so clearly, and what I wanted to ask you, and this is the part that I think is personal, is you know, what does it take to put yourself in that kind of an emotional place when writing a story like Emilio's and the other migrants? What does it take to do that, and what does it feel like?
Mm-hmm. I love that quote. I mean, and I love Saramago. The other Portuguese writer I love is Antunes, I guess.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say Pessoa because you quote.
Oh, I love Pessoa too, yeah. Yeah, there's three. And actually, I was thinking about Antunes because I don't know if you know his work. He's a wonderful writer. Difficult books in some ways, but he was a doctor for many years before he was writing full time. I think he worked at a psychiatric hospital. And or maybe it was early before that, it was a war. Here's a quote, something like that reminded me, where a child died, and the child was on a gurney, and his foot was his foot was hanging down. And he had an image in his mind of this foot, and he said something like, I write my books to honor that the foot, like the image, that duty. So you were asking about.
I guess I think what I'm asking is about that vulnerability, that willful placing of yourself in an emotional moment, and maybe it's not. It doesn't feel the way for you to write it as it does for me to read it, because there's the process of composition and all of the things. But I'm just wondering about the emotional reference.
I don't know. I mean, maybe in some ways I need to talk to a psychiatrist too. But but that sense of duty, like he talks about that child, that foot. So like the opening sequence I read to you, the child, that's I know that story. So. That's my sense of duty. Like, okay, I had to put that in there. There was a child to whom that happened, happened to. So in the book, there's all these moments from things that I was reading that had happened to people, and they stay like images in my mind. And I guess I've always worked that way, from these images, and I just focus on that. I don't know what it is that I don't know how it is that I came to do it. But I just feel like I have to. But honestly, then I haven't looked at this book in years, and I didn't want to look at it again. So, because then that's it. I did my part, and I'm out into something else. And it's true. After I wrote like the trilogy of books that were around war and some other things, humans not being kind to each other, then I wanted to write about sex for a while. Eros and Thanatos. Is like, I need to be out of that for a little while. So I don't know. I guess I know I'm not answering your question.
No, I think you are. I feel like I'm looking forward to your novel on photosynthesis.
Yeah. It's this long, though, you guys. It's that long. It's not long.
So I guess I'll stop there. Is that, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Does that sound fair? Yeah. I see a hand over here, and I have some microphones.
At risk of not spoiling the end, you crafted these beautiful thought narratives of what happened to different characters that we would lose along in the book. And so at the end, you carried us to Berkeley with Emilio and Matilde and beyond. And if the book ended, as I think it did end, I gotta be honest, as a reader, I felt so deeply, deeply unsettled from a place of privilege, from a place of, I really like a nice, tidy narrative. I really like my nice, tidy, comfortable life. And it really just unhinged me in that way. Was that intentional?
Yeah. My editor hated those. She hated that. She hated the dream sequences. You know, she wanted that too. And I understood what she wanted. But I was like, but I have this other thing always going on in my mind, which is the people, you know, those stories that I have to try. I have to do my best to write. You're like managing all these levels, but one of them is I got to honor what I understand to be the truth and the truths at play here. And so, yeah, so she didn't like that either, but yeah.
I just wanted to make also a plug. If you haven't read Luis Alberto Urrea's The Devil's Highway,
Yeah.
He has a scene that he narrates. It's a journalistic account, but it's more than that. It's really beautiful. And he has this, he narrates the death of a father and son, and he imagines their final journey together in this car on the way to the morgue. And it is one of the most beautiful, it's a tidy narrative, but man, it's
Yeah.
I don't know if you know which one I'm talking about.
There's another book too about it's a story. It's not a novel, but also about the crossing, about two brothers. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So I guess related to the ending. So what was the purpose and intent of the 3 case reports? One with Pedro, and then one with the unidentified man, and then one unidentified woman. My husband and I were debating this, so is this an alternative ending, or is it, was it the basis for your story, or was the happy ending a dream? So we're just trying to, or you're kind of leaving it up to the reader to decide.
That's right. But those Pima County records, I have spent a lot of time looking at them. They have recovered a lot of bodies, unclaimed bodies. I don't know what the numbers are right now currently. It's very dangerous to walk across that desert, and many people have disappeared there, and I think about that too. So just the realities of crossing the desert. If you're in the desert, I spent a lot of time reading about what happens to the body in that kind of heat, and so it's, again, when you're writing a novel, you're balancing so many things, right? You have the narrative, which you're thinking about, and then you're trying to think about verisimilitude, or what's actually happening to human beings. They do that in the story. So then you make choices as the writer, and some people don't like it, but yeah. But yes, both are possible. I think I too I like the comfort of the happy ending. It makes me feel good, and I'm not against that. It's just that that complexity of human life and human endeavor, and in this particular situation, that had to be in the book too. And that's why the book unfolds like a movie in a way. I wrote it that way. I saw it that way in my head. But again, I'm trying to manage these different levels of meaning or something like that. They all trying to get them in there.
In this talk, you kind of talk about language as sort of like an abstract concept, more of like a symbolism than like a manner of communication. And I guess my question for you is researching and hearing all these really intense and emotional stories. I guess it's a question of whether, is there a moment when you feel like language can't capture this sort of really traumatic element to these stories? And is there a process that you go to where you either like feel like you can't properly communicate it, or try to find a manner of communicating these really intense kind of ideas and narratives?
Yeah, this is your dad. Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, of course. I mean, how can we understand so many things like this? You know, this, or I couldn't understand in some ways. How do you understand a genocide? How do you understand that? How do you understand that? You know, many historical things that have happened in this country to Native peoples or slavery. You know, what I don't know. Understanding. And I think some things do feel beyond my ken, you know, but so that's why there's always this part of writing that, and I say this to my students, I'm like, I don't understand. Do you understand? I don't understand. But you can inquire deeply and try to allow for beauty and complexity, and you know, and language does seem to reach beyond into other, has the capacity to go into other, maybe, realms or something like that. It's hard. Have you ever read a poem where you're reading, you know you're reading the words in the poem, but something else is also happening? There's like a third thing or a fourth thing. Yeah, whatever that thing is. That the words kind of, and the images, right? It's sound, meaning, image, it's all, and something else can happen. I find that in poetry all the time. I mean, you can't say it's about this. Yeah, I guess the poem's about a Greek vase, you know, Keats or something. But you know, it's always like more. Hard to talk about. These are hard questions.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about the research that you did, and my reason is that I'm still so haunted by the scenes of the immigrants riding the beast.
Yeah.
Those were viscerally and still are viscerally upsetting to me.
Yeah.
The crossing the desert. And the third thing was, as I was seeing Emilio, the Berkeley College student, going through all this, I was looking through your eyes at people like many of us having to do that. We're the privileged people who got to go to the Berkeleys or whatever, and we're on the beast hanging on for our dear lives. How in the world did you get information that made that so detailedly physical and visceral?
Yeah. I mean, that's why Emilio is a great guide in the story, right? He's like, the journey story is a story we've all heard in many ways, but because he's this, he could have been my son, right? Or, you know, could have been any of us, and suddenly you're thrown into a situation where you're on this incredible thing that you didn't know. But in terms of research, as I mentioned earlier, when I wrote the first draft, and then I spent countless years drafting and revising and revising and revising and revising. I read the papers in Mexico. There were a lot of good reporting happening in Mexico. There were some documentaries made in Mexico about La Bestia. In Central America, especially in El Salvador, there was a paper there covering the migrant trail. And then weirdly, honestly, YouTube. A lot of migrants posting their stories, people interviewing, people crossing. We didn't get too deep into social media. And so there are bad things about the times we're living in, possibly around this, whatever it is, digital age, but there's some amazing things. I could never have written this book 10 years earlier. Like, I spend my time in the library and in archives, but this book, there were no books to read about it. So, and then later I started a storytelling project, and I learned more and more as I went. So I wrote it, and then, you know, as I learned, I'd fix things, I'd change things, tried to know the terrain as well as I could. But I've done that in every book I've ever written. I mean, the first book, yes, it's based on my grandparents who were from two towns, Harput and Alaza in Turkey, but that's gone. That's 100 years gone. I've never been there. I had to do the same kind of work in the imagination for that book in some ways as this one. You know, you're constantly as a writer like mining things for information. You're reading literature to write well, but you're mining everything else to like find the details. What did they see? What did they smell? What did they eat? You know, I realized when I was reading it, I was like, God, there's a lot of things here. You know, they're constantly because I was struck by that. Like, what do you carry when you're leaving? You know, my grandparents, people who move around, and people are on the move now in the world, right? We know this migration worldwide it's happening. What do you take if you can take something, and what can you carry? I don't know, I just think about all those things. So anyway, that's what I did. Everything I could find, I just was like, go in, try to find, and then you know, ask people, interview people. I have 2 friends who work. Well, now I have many more friends who work, and asking them. So those ways, but no books except the few. Urea's book. There's one really beautiful book. A few journalists working in English on our southern border who'd written tirelessly and valiantly about these stories for a long time. And you know, I didn't say this earlier, but when I first wrote the book and tried to sell it in New York, they were like, no, you know, because they're like, for them this was like, could have been on the moon, you know. It wasn't until our political situation changed, until the kids, a lot of kids came in 2014 when Obama was president, and then if you remember in 2019, which is when I sold this book, many years after I wrote its first draft, because the Trump administration separated children from their parents at our southern border, which is so horrific. You have to be a very cold-hearted person to think that that's okay, because it's not. Of course, you don't separate children from their parents. I think 500 and something, not sure the exact number, still they haven't found their parents. They're not reunited. So that's a terrible thing, and we knew that as a country. I mean, that was like, but at the same time I got a call from New York saying, hey, they're interested in buying your book now. So that's, you know, oh God, you're recording this. I don't know if this is good, I'm saying this.
Well, I think it speaks in some ways to market forces, right? How in some ways there's an uncomfortable ethics, I think, to market forces sometimes.
Yeah, and just, you know, awareness. I mean, I grew up in LA, I grew up near San Diego, going to Mexico all the time. That was in my awareness, but if you grow up here, you know, you have other stories that are here near you that are part of your, this is a huge country. So, on somebody's phone. I'm so glad it's not my phone. Usually it's my phone that is ringing.
I guess one last question, does that sound about right? Anybody?
I'd like to exercise the prerogative of holding the microphone. You chose the time, the May, June, ending in August of 2012. Was there a particular reason for that time range?
Yeah, because I think I actually wrote the book January to May of 2012. I was looking back because I forgot. The first draft, believe me, I had to do a lot more than that. I knew that they had to cross during the summer. I knew that the desert scene was in the summer. You know, again, I'm making decisions aesthetically, so I'm like balancing things I understand and know, but it has to work as a novel or it doesn't work. I'm not a historian, I'm not a journalist. So it had to be the summer because I knew they were going to walk in the summer. So I moved it. I don't even know when I did that. But once I read and came to try to understand that the desert sequence, you know, it's like, okay, it has to be in the book. Gets back to the early questions, like, I know, but it has to be there, and that has to be there, and that has to be there. Now, how do you get it to work? That's my job as a writer. How can I make it work as a book as best as I can? But, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
One more round of applause for.
Thank you so much.